All right, friends, I hope you are well. This is Dr. Scalise. I just got done typing up another article. I was reflecting while sitting on the couch, actually. I was watching some show about SEAL teams, and I just thought it's interesting. The United States government and really the wokeism, which is the birth child of really Western thought and Western hegemony, is one of the probably most shocking outgrowths of radical freedom as it has become divested of its virtuous underpinnings. And by this, what I mean is the fact that the founding fathers were very clear minded on this, that you had to maintain virtue in our country for our Constitution to work. Because our Constitution ensures the freedom of everything that the culture morally permits. So essentially, if the culture by and large morally permits whatever, right? I mean, if you can say that whatever behavior, bestiality, pedophilia, like pick some of the most grotesque ones that are really being advanced, trying to be advanced into the mainstream by the elites, by the wokeism culture. These can become protective behaviors if the society will morally accept it. And so it eventually becomes nothing more. Our Constitution's notion of freedom is designed to work together with the people that are set on and pointedly hoping to become ever more virtuous in achieving, quote, life, right? The pursuit of life, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I talk about this constantly if you're on my channel, and I keep saying it over and over again because it is the biblical definition, actually. The notion of freedom biblically has to do with being free and recognizing that you become ever more free the more that you govern yourself and behave in ways that are inherently good. Your choice for freedom, they widen, the horizon stretches out. When you choose for evil, this has a way of robbing you of freedoms. Ask anyone that's ever become an alcoholic or any other really well-known evil. The more that you practice evil, it has a consumptive effect upon you. It consumes your soul in the process as you exert what you believe to be freedom, when in truth it is the shackles and chains tightening around you. Now, I'm not trying to be preachy on this one necessarily, but we are kind of mixing quite a bit of philosophy, scripture, theology, worldview, and really even political science here as we discuss the nature of governmental power. And this won't be a reading. It says reading on the screen here, but this is actually just lost my train of thought, added commentary. So you can go to my website. Again, the link will be in the description if you actually want to read the article. It's not very long. It takes about 10 minutes to read. It's probably better to read it yourself than to try to listen to me read it, because trying to listen to me read my articles, sometimes I have to stop and think about what I say when I type. What comes out of me when I type is it's like totally different from the way I speak. My students would often tell me that when I was a professor, that reading stuff that I write can be very difficult, but when you listen to me in the classroom, it's easy to grasp what I'm trying to discuss. So the title here is Power, Demonism, and the Likeness to Governmental Power. And so I'm trying to build out really the fundamental nature of demonism and the nature of, call it, power divested of any virtuous underpinnings. And what divested of any of its virtuous underpinnings becomes this endless process of consuming or exerting its power, and that it can only perpetuate itself by continuing to consume. And if you listen to anything recently, I've been bringing the Hulk up a lot because he's the best image. The Hulk's power and rage, it can only be sustained so long as he becomes angrier and angrier. And whenever he loses objects of anger by which to feed his power, he loses his strength and he goes back to Bannon, right? So it's probably a pretty good imagery there to think about. Now, The key here, as we consider so much of this, is really that, and I'm thinking about kind of following along the article here, but I'm just gonna talk off the cuff because I just read the article. If you want to read it, you can. But the nature of power is something really shocking, and power itself is just raw capacity or ability or exertion, and so it really depends on what you tie power to, or that gives it its defining features. Because to say that something has ability or power or inherent some sort of just exertive activity doesn't really tell you very much about the nature of the power. And so Karl Barth, he's a very famous 20th century theologian, perhaps the most famous of the 20th century. He said something really interesting. He said the exertion of raw power for power's sake was something that was definitive of a definition of Satanism or Satan. And I butchered the quote, so if you're a Karl Barth fan and I just butchered the quote, I'm sorry. So the point is that the Almighty, and that's a title for God, right? Well, Barth says if we divest power of virtuous connotations, similar to what I'm discussing here about freedom, right? If you take virtue out of freedom, freedom becomes something that can become very destructive. Actually, it can become slavery over time. Similarly, with power, if you divest it of virtuous connotations, Karl Barth said that he could not think of a better definition for Satan and a better title for him than raw power, as articulated by calling someone the Almighty. And so El Shaddai, right, that's the Hebrew for the Almighty. This phrase has to be conjoined with, and if you take a look at the Old Testament, really the characteristics of God. So discuss it. I mean, there's 3 lists in the Old Testament that basically give you a summary view of God, and part of that is abundant in grace, abounding in loving mercy, forgiving, but no way clearing the injustices done by the evil. So you kind of get this interesting, like he's just, but he's also definitionally graceful. So you get this interesting virtuous connotations attendant to, however, that God, El Shaddai, is going to use his power. It isn't just raw power for the sake of exerting power. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of almost all verses in the Bible that have the word power in it, because we just think of the way that humans use power, and the way that humans use power is to get their way. It's flat and simple. We use power to get our way, or we use power to exert our own ideas of things, our own image, and to try to enforce some measure of conformity on others so that they will likewise advance, continue, or spread our image to other places and onto other people. So power itself is really, call it ambiguous, unless you need to know the character of the one exerting the power to be able to determine the nature of the power. So for instance, if you go to a really famous text in Philippians chapter 2, it's going to discuss the power, like Paul saying, oh, how I desire to know the power of his resurrection. And you're looking at this, and the way that he's using the word power makes zero sense if you insert the human definition of power as this kind of like power to get my way, or totalitarian effort to enforce conformity to my ideals, right? So the way Paul's using it seems to be the sense of influence for love. So exertion for love. How I desire to know the exertion of love of the resurrection. That's what's being said there when you hear that phrase, power of resurrection. It's not power in the worldly BS sort of way, because it is a fundamental corruption of power. It is the divesting of all that makes power good and usable and effective for giving life. It effectively makes power nothing but a destructive force whose end is annihilation. Now, with that being said, governments are very well known, 20th century especially, and as we face our day today, we are very scared by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations and the union of the two towers, as it were, from Lord of the Rings. The two evil towers have united. And so their prophet, Yuval Harari, has publicly announced on more than one occasion that free will is over. And so the nature of demonism, fundamentally at its most base level, is the desire to control or dominate or remove freedom. That is at its most basic layer. And it's not just that, but it's also a coercion to involve those who are dominated to participate in extending that domination beyond itself. It has no end that is meaningful. The exertion of power for power's sake is always a self-consumptive and suicidal task, because you must feed the beast for the beast to survive. But inevitably, inexorably, over time, sustenance to feed the beast will just not be available at some point. And I don't know when that's going to be, right? I have no idea, but I know that the duration there is limited, because raw power for power's sake is something that can only perpetuate itself so long as it has free will people out there to dominate and to crush their free will. Then it fuels its power. It fuels it, right? It keeps it moving. So governmental power, totalitarianism, and understand that totalitarianism is what's called the tyranny of the same. And you probably never thought about this, but really, wokeism in the West, for instance, and I hate the fact that it's come out of, I believe, I read something somewhere, and somebody cite me on this or call me on it if I'm wrong, but that wokeism is some sort of like Pentagon operation. It's the manner in which we create narrative warfare on the world. The West creates narrative warfare on the world. And it's sad to me because I find wokeism to be so abundantly detestable and so full of vice that a nation that was historically defined by Western Christendom is now being defined by, and I don't know, like atheists out there. It's funny because I don't know if I have any atheists that listen to me, but I mean, I just think it's like, right? I mean, if atheism true, you can't really have objective morality. So it's just like whatever the vote is of the common population. But, you know, in this horrific despotic world, and this is the way the world typically works, because totalitarianism is the norm. It is not the exception. It is the norm. It is the elites then that decide what is morally acceptable. In the world of social media and big tech and big media, it is no longer the vote of the common people that will determine what is moral, right? So when you're an atheist, you know, you don't have an objective God out there or any other way to make morality objective. And I know some of the more sophisticated attempts at this by atheists, and I'm just going to tell you that they fail, because you have to appeal to some sort of abstract Platonic realm, and that's easily defeated simply because nobody's actually ever experienced that. All experience of abstract ideas is utilizing your mental apparatus called your mind or your brain. And as such, to postulate an abstract realm is to postulate something that is just impossible to experience. And as such is readily unconvincing. Okay, set that to the side. I kind of got sidetracked there for a second, but totalitarianism, this wokeism, it's the desire to replicate itself, because in replicating itself, it advances its own narrative and its own power. So is it just governmental power, governmental tyranny, totalitarianism as a kind of demonism is itself a rejection of the other fundamentally at the baseline, you don't want them to be able to retain their identity. You demand conformity with the identity you offer, and you demand it. And so I think there's a really nice distinction here to make about right, the cross, Jesus Christ, and that image, because I think, and rightfully so, and understand, like, every sin you can imagine, every hypocrisy you can imagine has been performed by Christians, as it has been by every worldview. I mean, there's no worldview you're going to go to and say you upheld your positions perfectly, right? I mean, it's just nonsense to think that. And I'm not excusing it. I'm not trying to create moral equivalency here. I'm trying to draw out the fact that Christianity has insanely high bars set for itself in many respects. And as such, the failure to meet that standard is going to be very frequent. Not an excuse, but of course, there's also a morality there, a fidelity, a faithfulness to an entity out there that creates a additional morality that those that are atheists or a non-theistic persuasion don't even involve their soul in. And that could be a pretty big impairment to an overall moral system. Or we theists just believe in an imaginary person and we're mentally ill, as the claim goes. I always thought that was funny, just because, the idea that there is a God out there is like a very prevalent one across world history. And so just interesting to argue, like, oh, well, that means you have mental illness. You're like, well, so you're trying to say the normal behavior for humanity across human history is to have mental illness by believing in a God or gods, right? So kind of a fascinating argument to try to take that attempt to really diminish, I guess, the sociological evidence of so many people groups across history. So totalitarianism is a demonism. It aims to replicate itself in its norms that are contrary to virtuous living. Because here's the thing: once you are at the point where you're willing to coerce or force people to become like you, you've already abandoned the fundamental message of the cross or the gospel, which is you suffer, you labor, you exert in order to persuade. Right? You're not using power. You're not using your power to enforce your image. You're using your power to present it, to be persuasive with it. And in that, therefore, it is loving in that effectiveness in the way that it goes about it. And instead of being oppressive or suppressive. And again, like I said earlier, clear distinction here. The cross versus a totalitarian way of exerting and replicating one's image. And yes, the Christians have been hypocritical of that many, many times. I've been hypocritical of that. Very easy to want to go with the instinctual, I guess, mode of violence. I think that's pretty instinctual for a lot of people. Replicate your image through coercion, potentially through deception. And then basically involve yourself in a behavior pattern. So exerting your power to prolong your power. That is inherently nihilistic. It's set on nothingness. Its ultimate end is nothingness, because you can only continue to exert your power to exert it so long as it has something to feed on. So it's fundamentally self-consumptive. And I made this point earlier in passing. It's not to be missed that when you try to dominate others, when you try to control them, when you try to exert totalitarianism on others, you diminish yourself. Your heart becomes smaller, your capacities become smaller, and in some sense you lose ever greater degrees of freedom to choose, because leaving freedom in place for others is likewise, in some sense, leaving freedom in place for yourself. As you seek to rob freedom of others, you slowly but surely, as you digest, as you ingest all of this really profoundly evil behavior, you become patterned into that behavior. You create habits. and you over time lose the ability to choose. And I think most of us have probably experienced this with our own evil behaviors. If you haven't experienced that, I'd be surprised. Maybe you're really young and you're listening to that. If you're young enough, you might not have lived long enough, and good for you, so that's great. It's one of the reasons why children, they say, are, right? Jesus said the kingdom of God is made up of such as these, talking about the children. Pretty fantastic, pretty interesting, reflective point there to think like, oh, like, you know, for all my great attempts at becoming a saint, holy and all that, right? Like, the kids got it, man. The kids got it figured out. You know what they got figured out more than anyone? It's the fact that you're supposed to have fun. It's supposed to be fun. That's the entire point of life, is fun. I mean, like, discovery and fun. It's the idea, the biblical idea is joy. It uses the word joy. So just fascinating. That kids could have it wrapped up, right? Pretty interesting. So demonism then, if you consider like the fall and what happened with Satan and all that, but I mean, it really is just saying that you want to self-promote yourself and you want to advance your idea, your form, your image, contrary to what you know to be fundamentally good for others, because your image becomes the all-consuming point of the power. And so it's suicidal. This type of power exertion is suicidal over the long run, because, as I said many times now, it can't continue to sustain itself. And if you consider demonism to be the fundamental rejection of the life-giving spirit, which is, if you read my article here, that's the whole point, is that you have a choice. You're either going to be a life-consuming spirit, or you're going to be a life-giving spirit. You're going to join God in the harmony of life-giving and have the resources that give life, because you are actually joined to the infinite source of all life, a being that has life in himself. Or you're going to be left on the other side of the divide, which leaves you with the only option to be a consumptive spirit. And when I say spirit, I'm just talking about person. Just every person has a spirit, so you can just call person spirit. It's interchangeable. Not anything funny here going on with the way I'm using that word. It's just another way to talk about persons, but to talk about them as spiritual entities, right? Without me having to say all that. So spirits, you're either going to be a consumptive spirit, a consuming spirit, a spirit that robs people of life, or you're going to be a life-giving spirit. And there's two sides of the divide. It's really simple. Super simple. Totalitarianism, that bent towards totalitarianism and towards dominating and controlling, that is the consuming spirit. Their God is their stomach, to quote the Bible. Right? That's why it says that. That verse says that. It's because it's the imagery is that you consume. It's a God that needs to consume to perpetuate itself. That's the point. Or the other option is to be a life-giving spirit. That would be a spirit that's willing to persuade, it's willing to convince, it's willing to exert its own power and its own resources in order to build up that which is good, in order to advance what is good, and in order to invite people to consider the goodness that hopefully you're performing in more or less sorts of ways. And that's the choice. Life-consuming spirit, life-giving spirit. And they're intermixed, right? So, I mean, and if you read the article, I give an explanation for this, but essentially the explanation is, you know, the objection would be something like this. Oh, well, you know, I know lots of people that aren't Christians that do all sorts of edifying or life upbuilding behaviors with others. That's good and fine, because essentially, if the Holy Spirit's true, right, spirit of life, the life-giving spirit, if everything we know about him is largely accurate or mostly accurate, the fundamental point is that, you know, every human, by virtue of being made in the image of God and having that original connection with the Spirit of God when it breathed life into them, has a certain amount of imprinting on them and remembrance in their soul. It gives them some measure of capacity to function in these two arenas, to be a life giver or a life consumer. And in this, and there's a certain amount of God, this world is the testing ground to see what our metal is made of, to find out if we have the stuff to be involved in God's kingdom. And remember, it's not a meritocracy. It's about trust. It's about harmony. It's about communion. It's about these relational ideas that aren't effectively working to get yourself into heaven. You can't work yourself into heaven. That's silly. God isn't a businessman. He's not going to trade you your effort for keys to the kingdom. That's not the way it works. But you can involve yourself in that deep harmony of life giving, and then connect yourself to that and want to continue in that. And so we're about 25 minutes in. I wasn't going to do a long one here, and it's late. I'm getting tired, so we'll probably stop there. Today's July 30th, 2022. This has been a discussion of Against All Odds, Power, Demonism, and the Likeness of Governmental Power. And demonism, as I stated many times, and actually you have this really clearly articulated in so much storytelling. I think 1984 is a great one for taking a look at the nature of conformity, and the reason why the party exists is to advance the image of the party, and everything has to be rewritten in order to have conformity to the party lines, etc. That would be like the massive extrapolation of demonism to radical ends, and we're coming upon that with the World Economic Forum and the nuttiness with them redefining words constantly. They just redefined a word in Wikipedia on recession like 2 days ago. Like, the definition's been the same forever, and they're like, it can't be having people say this is a recession. We got to change the definition. It's like crazy, but I mean, that's where we're at. And that will kind of always be the leaning of a government. Governments are inherently bad or evil unless they have a massive check on them. That's the reason why the American Constitution is so good. It's because it puts a big check on it. And even that, as we're seeing, is failing by and large. But this battle's not over. We can still beat the World Economic Forum, but it is a fundamental battle, not just for some like, oh, I hope my kids have a future. This is a fundamental battle for humanity as a species, as free will entities, and a resistance to what I think are demonic powers. Because remember, the biblical witness on this points out the fact that Satan and demons, they obsess over, they focus down on positions of power. Principalities are in their world these high positions of power, and so they focus down their influence into those high positions of power. And so we would expect to find this demonic totalitarianism that we're discussing here, that we see come out in governments. We would expect it to come out in those localities that have the farthest reach, which are the most powerful governmental people on the planet, right? So they're going to be particularly targeted by this demonism, which is a bent towards, the demonism we're talking about today is this bent towards totalitarianism, to want to remake everything into its own image that is fundamentally opposed to the good, to replicate it and thereby and thereby force people into this quest of self-destructive behavior that has its ultimate end as annihilation, essentially. So that's the best I can do in kind of a summary way to wrap this up. Thanks so much for joining me. This is Dr. Scalise. Take care, friends.